to have my dear friend and colleague, Rav Shua Solomon from Mizrachi Shul. And it's great to have, this different style of shiur, more conversational, Q&A, chatting, and but also obviously bringing in our own personal journeys, plus as well some insights on faith and Chanukah. So that's kind of the objective for tonight. And the past 2 weeks, I've interviewed 2 other personalities, rabbinic personalities here in Sydney, and saved the best for last. Hey, Rav Shua?
You're always full of compliments. But first of all, I think it's a really good idea. And always happy to be part of whatever you're organizing. But I thought this was a really nice idea. And I was speaking to to Rabbi Elton actually the other day, because I watched a little bit of the first one talk, I think, that you did with him, and I asked him if he enjoyed it, and his response was, everyone enjoys talking about themselves. So look, I'm looking forward to that, and I guess I'm looking forward, hopefully, to also between both of us being able to maybe shed some light and spread some light and some important messages in the lead up to Chanukah. I also noticed that Ben, as usual, was dressed in a jacket and tie. So I decided, I don't think I own a tie anymore, but I decided to at least put a jacket on.
Well, thanks very much for giving it the respect that it deserves. I mean, I just took mine off, but I'm glad at least you're in a jacket. So, Rav Shua, please tell us, let's just delve into it. Tell us a little bit about your background, your past, because what we eventually want to get to is, what led you towards taking on more of a commitment towards Jewish leadership. Obviously, you're well known, your father's well known as a rabbi in Perth, but tell us a little bit more about your background.
No problem. So for those who don't know, I grew up in Perth, Western Australia. I did say to Rabbi Yossi when he asked me, I said, I'm not sure my story is as interesting as Rabbi Elton or Rabbinate Judith, but, I guess in reflection, I still don't think it's as interesting as theirs, but I'll share some of my, the way I grew up and sort of what inspired me a little bit. For me, it was kind of almost impossible not to be involved in Jewish or communal work in some way or another, given the family that I was born into in Perth. My parents both very involved in the community. My father, it's kind of hard to, I don't know if I could list all the different organizations in Western Australia, Jewish organizations that he's been involved in. Very involved. I mean, he still has, and started his own shul, as well as the fact that he's a full-time barrister. Served on the Carmel School, which is the only Jewish school in Western Australia, served as the vice president of the board for, almost the entire time I could think of growing up. He was, and still is, very involved in the school there. My mother helped start an akiva in Perth. So our house was just sort of swarming with community work, and that was always on people's minds. And I haven't even begun to talk, that's just my parents, but when I think about my grandparents, very heavily from all sides. My father's father was the president of the shul. My grandmother, or both my grandmothers, were very heavily involved both in the shul and the school. And my mother's father was not just communally involved, but was also a minister in federal and state politics. So that kind of, I could talk about that for hours, but no one wants to hear that. But I think that it was almost impossible then, with what I'd grown up as in the role models that I saw, to not be involved in some way in community life. It probably, I thought about it going in many different directions as I grew up. And I guess when you're little, it's a little bit different. In fact, when you're little and you kind of misbehave and someone goes, would your father or your mother approve of what you're doing? And they kind of use my parents and their communal involvement to say, you're really living up to their expectations. I didn't enjoy that. But when you get a little bit older, you kind of learn to not just respect and appreciate, but really admire like I still do the work that my parents and grandparents have done and do for the community. And that in a lot of ways led me to choose that kind of work, at least for now, in a more dedicated and sort of full-time and professional kind of role. But like I said, there are probably many stages along the way, but that's definitely was my inspiration.
Can I jump in for a second? I mean, often you see people when well, firstly, you mentioned role modeling and how your parents, grandparents have obviously set that model for you, and you followed. But often you see people, when they grow up, they either go one of two ways. They either go in the mold that's kind of been laid out for them or that they've witnessed, or they go in the opposite direction, in a quest to find their own individuality. So you've obviously found and managed to find your own individuality, but within the community, within, the rabbinate. Your father's a rabbi. You've obviously seen that within your own home and decided you want to follow in that, but kind of make it your own. How do you feel like you've made it your own and as an individual?
How do I feel like? Look, I don't think I have exactly the same personality and style as my father. I think in a lot of ways we're very different, but I also think that you can have role models, but which you take lessons from and ask advice from, but not necessarily model them exactly in the way in what they've created. And I can't really see myself ever sort of going and being a rabbi right next door to him. Like I couldn't see myself, for example, being this kind of job in Perth. There's an interesting Talmudic statement which says there's no, and in Hebrew it's ein navi be'iro, which is kind of means there's no prophet in their own city. In other words, sometimes you kind of, especially in my case, when my father was the rabbi, I didn't kind of want to just be the person, do exactly what he did, and sort of be a rabbi for all these people that remember me still in nappies. So moving to being in it, I came from Israel to Sydney, not from Perth, but being a rabbi in a different city in Australia has definitely helped. And I think you can, like I said, you can learn lots of different lessons from people and ask advice, etc. And at the same time know that your style is a little bit different and you don't necessarily have the same goals. And I would say also that the community is very different. What I'm trying to do is very different. And whilst maybe the overarching goals are still the same, it's a different situation. And of course, I guess I'm trying to forge my own path as well.
Okay, great. So let's continue. Let's go back and see. Obviously, you saw it growing up, the role modeling of that behavior, the open house to the community, the selfless, the many hours that both your parents gave. Actually, a question just came in from Yaakov. He wants to know, can you just share with us maybe just 30 seconds about your grandfather who was the politician involved in politics?
Yeah, of course. My grandfather was, Zichrono Livracha, blessed memory, passed away just a couple of years ago. My mother's father, his name was Joe Berenson. He was a member of the Labour Party, a federal. He was actually the Minister for the Environment in Gough Whitlam's government in the early 70s. And then after he lost his seat in I think it was 1975. A few years later, he went into state politics and actually served as the Western Australian Attorney General for over a decade.
Wow.
Still the longest serving Attorney General. So, by the time I was growing up, he had actually retired from politics, and a very humble man, didn't often boast or talk so much about his time in politics. You really had to get it out of him. But I would say that there are two really important lessons that I learned from him that I think is still with me on a day-to-day basis. One was his incredible attitude towards being principled and doing the right thing. Often when I would have discussions with him as a teenager growing up, even if, the decisions that somebody had to make were difficult, he was very much into always making sure you did the right thing by other people and you did the right thing in terms of just being a mensch and doing sort of what the right thing to do would be morally and value on a value basis in any situation. And the second thing he taught me, which actually was mentioned after he passed away, Malcolm Turnbull, who at the time was the Prime Minister, gave a tribute to him in federal parliament. And Malcolm, or Prime Minister Turnbull, actually mentioned it at this point when he gave that tribute, was that I asked him once why he decided to go into politics, and he said many people think you go into public roles sort of for the big moments, the big speeches, but the biggest satisfaction that he had as a member of parliament or a minister were the small things that he was able to do to help people in their day-to-day lives that didn't necessarily make the news or the media, but he could see the impact it had on other people. So I think that those are two lessons that, he taught me many things, but I think those are two lessons that he taught me that kind of stick in my mind on a daily basis in my own work.
Beautiful. That's really nice. Wow. So yeah, and tell us a bit about Israel, because after you finished school, right? You went to what's the main Jewish school in Perth?
Carmel.
So you went to Carmel, you finished there, and then you went straight to Israel?
Yeah, I went straight to Israel. I was very involved growing up in Bnei Akiva, so sort of that's kind of following the Bnei Akiva path. You finish year 12, you go on a gap year on one of the Bnei Akiva programs. So I went to on a Bnei Akiva program called MTA, which is mainly actually the girls spend time in madrasha or seminary, the boys in yeshiva, and they kind of get together on weekends and holidays, etc. So I spent a year in the Gush in Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is in Alon Shvut, in Gush Etzion, which is sort of where most boys on the MTA program went. My wife, actually, I didn't know at the time she was going to be my wife, but my wife was actually on the program as well. We weren't dating then, but my wife was on the same program in the same year. She's from Melbourne, I'm from Perth, but most people actually went back at the end of that year. And I always joke with my wife, we actually were not going out at all then. I don't even know if we were friends, but she came up to me to say goodbye at the end of that year. And she said, if you become a rabbi, I'll go to your shul, which is quite funny now. She doesn't have a choice anymore. But after that, many people decided to go back, start university in Australia. It was a program with Australians and South Africans. I decided to continue my studies in yeshiva. I don't know if at that time I was necessarily doing it because I wanted to be a rabbi, but I knew that I at least wanted to spend 1 or 2 more years in yeshiva, increase my knowledge. I didn't have, obviously I learned with my parents and my father especially, but I didn't have a lot of, unlike in the Eastern States, there isn't a lot of opportunity for in-depth Jewish learning. And so at that time, I wasn't 100% sure I wanted to go down that road, but I definitely knew that I wanted to study a bit more. And I guess over time, I developed a real passion for teaching, for trying to kind of help at least to spread a message of dedication to Judaism, to your identity, to Torah, to mitzvot. After a couple of years, I actually decided that if I was living in Israel for an extended period of time, I should go to the IDF. So I went and enrolled in the Israeli army. I was part of the Hesder program, which for those who don't know is sort of a combination of Torah study and military service. And I was in the army as an infantry soldier for 1.5 years, which was one of the more interesting time periods in my life. I can't say I was the best soldier in the world. Definitely no Rambo, but it was very interesting and I think important part of my life as well. I was there for 1.5 years. I was a combat medic as well. And then after that, I came back to complete sort of my rabbinic studies. And by then, I think, once I'd finished the army, I was more set on kind of the path I wanted to go in. I wouldn't necessarily say that I thought I was going to end up being a rabbi in Sydney, but one of the things that I think was important for me was by this time, I was 23, 24 years old. I had actually enrolled in an education degree, which you can do there's a teacher's college right next to the yeshiva. And, I was doing a lot of teaching of these gap year students. And at one point I kind of said to myself, it's really nice that I'm teaching them, and I hope they're finding it interesting, but I think if I really want to make an impact and an influence on their lives and the lives of their families, you can't just do that in the few months that you're teaching them. You've really got to be on the ground. So I did have in the back of my mind that I'd like to come back. Again, it wasn't necessarily set in Sydney, but I did have in my mind that that was possibly something I'd like to do. I grew up in Australia. To go back to Australia in some kind of rabbinic role. So that's kind of how it started.
Right. Okay. And just going back to the army for a second, right? So you were there for a year and a half. Was that, so you were a combat medic as part of that year and a half?
Yeah. I was a combat medic as part of that year and a half. Sometime through the basic training course, they asked me to, well, actually, that's not entirely true. At one point, I realized, they were asking for volunteers to go to this medics course and then come back to the unit and be the medic as part of sort of the unit. You'd still continue in your duties like everyone else, but on top of that, you'd also be a medic. And at the time, I looked around to all the other jobs that were being given out, and I wasn't in line to get any of those. So I thought to myself, medic's a really important role. It might be something I might be good at, and it's something the army needs. So why don't I go and do it? So I went and did a 3-month course, the medics course. I went sort of to a different base, did a medics course, and came back. Thank God I didn't have to use it that much.
So at that point, right? At that point, were you still exploring yourself and trying to figure out like what it is like that you are really passionate about? Are you passionate about serving the Jewish people, the Jewish people in the IDF, a medic? Like, are you exploring different ideas? Or,
yeah. No.
Or did you find even within the IDF, you were still trying to do some outreach and trying to inspire? Like, what did you find about yourself during that time?
Now, that's a really good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question, and it's a really important one. I think the army for me was a real eye-opener, as it is, I think, for many Israelis. Forget those who come from overseas, but it's a real melting pot of lots of different personalities, lots of different cultures, lots of different backgrounds. And I was in a unit, by the end, I was in a unit of mostly religious soldiers, but still it was an eye-opener in terms of Israeli identity, what that means to be Israeli, what it means to serve in the IDF, what are these people's ambitions and goals for the future. And the army probably left me asking a lot more questions than answers. I don't necessarily think that it kind of pulled me in one direction or another in terms of the role that I have now, but it definitely makes you grow up faster in terms of your responsibility and role. I had the one part I really enjoyed about the army was the social aspect, and kind of the friends that you make, the camaraderie, of course.
Yes.
Believe it or not, the physical aspect I enjoyed less. And there's some really funny stories about that as well. But I think in terms of a Jewish and Israeli identity, and seeing it, just as if I could share one very brief story, just to give you an example of the types of, I remember finishing I was in Nachal, which is known historically, even though it's not so much like that today, but it's known historically as a very secular kibbutz kind of unit. And I remember finishing one particularly difficult exercise, and anything was kind of difficult for me when it involved physical activity. So I remember finishing one exercise, and there was a guy there who was quite high up, and you could tell by the falafels he's got on his shoulder, and he could tell that I was pretty hungry and tired. So he says to me, "Here, little soldier, have a sandwich." Right. And, he himself wasn't religious whatsoever. But I thought, obviously I can eat this sandwich, it's just been made in the army kitchen. All army kitchens are kosher. Right. So, and I'm really hungry. I'm just going to tuck into the sandwich. Anyway, so I have a bite, and I can taste in my mouth that although I'm sure the food was kosher, he'd put meat and cheese in the sandwich, and he wasn't doing it to have a go at me or try and get me to do something that I believed wrong. I think he was just kind of ignorant of that kind of thing. So that's kind of an example of all the different people that you have serving in the Israeli army, and all really for the same purpose, but at the same time coming very much from different backgrounds and identities. And it does kind of, and I didn't have answers, and I'm not sure that I have all the answers to these questions anyway still now, but it does force you to ask yourself kind of what is your role in terms of the greater role of the Jewish people? What is your role in terms of the identity of the IDF? Where do you see yourself in the future? I think I only started to answer those questions after I came back to yeshiva. And maybe those answers by then were a bit more biased, right? Because I was once again surrounded by people who, obviously we were different, but still kind of thought like me and behaved like me.
So you came back to yeshiva. This was straight after the army. You went straight back into yeshiva?
Yeah, around this time, actually. Yeah, like in other words, around Chanukah time, I went from August 2011 to December 2012. So I went.
And that's when you did your smicha?
Yeah. So I'd already started a little bit actually before I went to the army, but yes, I continued it after that as well.
And again, you did that for the knowledge, or you did that with in mind that perhaps you wanted to practice down the line?
No. It was definitely in mind that I wasn't sure in what way I was going to use it, but I definitely did it with that in mind.
Okay, so
whether I was getting. Sorry.
You finish your smicha, and then what happens?
So this is an interesting question. I was finishing a whole lot of things just kind of fell into place at that moment. I was actually coming to Australia for a friend's wedding, and I got an email. Actually, looking back, I don't remember how he knew or had heard of me. Maybe the Australian connection. I'm from Australia after all, and from the then president, still very involved in the shul, Michael Goldberg, who was then the president of Mizrachi in Sydney, and he said, "We heard you coming to Australia. Would you be prepared to?" Heard you're coming to Australia for a wedding, and this wedding actually was not in Sydney; it was in Melbourne. He said, "Would you be prepared to spend that Shabbat in Sydney and maybe speak at the shul, and we'll have a chat?" I think it was with in mind that in the future I might become the rabbi. At the time they didn't have a rabbi, but you'd have to ask Michael. I don't actually remember all the details. Anyway, so of course I kind of agreed to it because I like that stuff, and it sounded like a nice Shabbat. And so I spoke in the shul. Actually around that time I also started dating Michal, so all these things kind of were happening at once. And after that weekend, Michael gave me a call and said, would you like to come back? Because I think I was already coming back to Australia in a few months' time to do counterpoint as one of the overseas medrachim from Maroubra College. So he said, well, if you're there anyway, do you want to just spend a few more weeks in Sydney? And you could be, because they always had a rabbi for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, even though they didn't have a rabbi consistently throughout the year. Would you be prepared to stay for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? And I said yes. And then afterwards, after that time, I was already engaged actually. And Michael said to me, okay, now that you've done Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, how would you feel about coming here sort of to live and be the rabbi? And, there were discussions about that and whether it would work and how it would work, I think, for a few months after. And then, we signed the contract, and I came in the middle of 2015. Truth is, at the time, it was going to be my first sort of full-time job. I had no idea what it means. I had a little bit of an idea. We spoke about my parents. So I had a little bit of an idea what it means to be a community rabbi, but I'd say that some of the things that have happened to me that I've had to deal with, the challenges I faced, the highs, the low, whatever you want to call it, right? I had no idea about any of this stuff when I signed the contract. And Rabbi Yossi, I probably, similar with you when you started your first role. I really had no idea. And if someone said to me, you're going to have to deal with this, this, and this, at the time when I signed the first contract, I'm not sure how keen I would have been. But on the more positive side, it's given me, I think, an amazing and enormous sense of, for the most part, 95% of it, I love my work, and an enormous sense of a feeling that my work is meaningful. So, and the community has been amazing to us. So, I'm, how much of my, and maybe this is a discussion we can have at another time, but how much of my time in yeshiva, learning inside texts and books, etc., prepared me for my life as a community rabbi, I'd say very little.
Yeah.
But I think that might be the same with many roles that people have throughout their lives. What you learn at university in a textbook, even if it's, you stay in the profession that you learn, you studied for, real life is not a textbook, as we know. So, I've had to learn a lot on the job. And
I agree entirely. Same with me.
Yeah. So some of it's been sort of just, nothing replaces experience, I guess. So just learning on the job.
I also came into the rabbinate because I guess you had a father who's a rabbi, you had a grandfather politician, all very community minded. My father's a doctor, my grandfather's a businessman. My father's also very committed to shul, and I kind of grew up going with him to South Edge Shul. But I was kind of the first kind of rabbi in the line. I did have a brother-in-law who is a celebrity rabbi, but I kind of knew I was going in with like open eyes, like ready for anything, because I wasn't sure what to expect when I first came in. But my question to you is, growing up in the house of a rabbi, do you find once you became your own rabbi, did you have greater appreciation for what your father had to do, or does on an ongoing basis? Because now you're seeing firsthand, you're counseling people, you're going through their traumas with them, through their excitement with them, their life journey with them. Did it really give you? Do you feel like you were set up more so because you had a father who was already in it, or were you kind of thrown in the deep end anyway?
No, I was kind of thrown in the deep end anyway. I definitely. So I'm not saying I didn't learn anything from growing up in my father's house, and seeing him as a rabbi, but different community, much smaller, Perth, and right. I think the roles that he had were a little bit, I'm sure some were similar, but the similar part I feel like he didn't really share with me. And then there's a whole lot of part that's different as well, and it's sort of a different generation. I will very often ask him for advice, but at the same time, I think that I was kind of, I think that most of it was just thrown in the deep end.
Yeah, it must be nice that you can connect with your father professionally, not just because you're family and he's your dad, but professionally you can actually have these deep, meaningful conversations. And
I always that's very true. I also always think that we say that imitation is the highest form of flattery.
Yes.
I've got two brothers.
Okay.
And my father throughout his life, at one point he was a teacher, he's a rabbi, of course, and a lawyer. So I'm a rabbi. One of my brothers is a lawyer, and the other brother is a teacher. So that you can't get greater imitation and flattery than that, I don't think. But yeah, look, it is nice. I think there's certain things that I kind of, now that we talk about it, and obviously there's a lot of things that we kind of understand and talk about in terms of similarities and things that he might have been through, which he just never shared with me, but kind of, when I can ask him now for advice, he'll say, yeah, this kind of thing happened to me. And then, give me some really important advice. But at the same time, I think there are certain things about each sort of our communities that we don't really necessarily understand about each other.
Yes.
And we kind of, so yeah, look, obviously, my parents and grandparents, not just an inspiration, but people who, could ask for advice as well. But at the same time, I think, there was a lot of learning that I just kind of had to do by myself. And I think that looking back, I've still, don't get me wrong, right? Like, I've still got a lot more learning to do as well. But looking back on it, my first few months, even, I think, in some ways it was good. That's kind of, it's scary, and you might make a lot of mistakes, but it's also a really valuable way to learn.
So Rav Shua, just moving us along now, and thanks for sharing with us your personal journey, which I think is just as interesting as the previous 2 weeks. But, as we go through life and we experience challenges and different, the trials of life, many people I know question, they question their faith, they question their purpose in life, they question why they're put on this earth, what they're supposed to achieve, what direction they should be going in. So I guess I want to ask you, did you have any challenging moments in your life? And then linking it to the idea of faith, what does faith mean to you? How did you cling to your faith? And not just cling to your faith, but actually embrace it and make it a force that has inspired you and thereby has now fueled you to go and spread that inspiration with others, which is what you do on a daily basis. So have you had any defining moments, any trials? And also, what does faith, mean to you when I say that word faith?
Okay, so that's like, how long do I have to answer this question?
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. No worries. I think that, I don't know about that. Look, I think in terms of defining moments, probably had a number of, I wouldn't necessarily say they were one moments, but periods in my life which kind of guided me to the values and ideals that I have now. I think in terms of difficult times, and I don't like, because my difficult times really compared to some of the other things people have had to deal with, especially in the year 2020, you can't even compare. But I think, in a number of ways, both personally and professionally, this year has been very difficult. It's probably a lot better now than it was 6 or 7 months ago, but there were definitely times this year where I questioned my value, not as a person, but also as a rabbi. And I think, you'll testify as well that we everyone in different ways. It's been very difficult for rabbis. It's been very difficult for many people in very many different professions. But I definitely did reach a point this year where I really, I think was stuck and felt really down about a number of things, both in terms of my role as a rabbi personally, and kind of had to sort of reach out for help and sort of work out, what the answers to some of those questions were. I think in terms of faith, I talk about it from 3 different aspects. One is faith in yourself, which I definitely continue to struggle with at times. My oldest son, who's not even 3, when I ask him who he loves, so before he talks about his dad or his mum or his little brother, he kind of says, "Oh, his name's Eitan." He says, "I love Eitan," right? And we're kind of taught, I wasn't sure how I felt about that answer, right? Because, it's not about ourselves. But at the same time, I also kind of feel like, that's kind of where it starts. Not in terms of just thinking, I'm amazing and everything I do is perfect. And not from an arrogance perspective, but a person has to be able to have faith in themselves and faith that what they're doing is meaningful to other people or is making a difference. And they do have talents and they do have strengths, and those things are important to share with other people. That one of the famous, I guess, Hasidic rabbis, the Kotzker Rebbe, he used to put 2 notes, one in each pocket. So in one pocket he had the well-known Talmudic saying, "Bishvili nivra ha'olam," that for me the world was created. That I am actually bringing something unique to the world. And in the other pocket, he would have the words "Va'anochi afar ve'ifer," right, from the Torah, that I am just dust and ashes. That, you know, at the same time, we have to realize that we're not that important, but on the one hand, on the other hand, to realize, yeah, we actually do have a role, and a really important role to play in the world. And that is actually an important and crucial part of the world. Yeah, we're human beings and we make mistakes. At the end of the day, we all have the same ending. But you know, it's really important to realize that we really all have strengths and important things to bring to the world. I think the second is faith in other people. And then I think, you know, when I was going through a difficult time, that probably is what inspired me more than anything else. You know, the people that I might have guided, or at least tried to guide through difficult situations, and their resilience and strength and ability to get through it and cope, not just to cope, but actually to come out as stronger people. That to me has been the biggest example and role model in my life as a rabbi. You know, I guess as the rabbi, your congregants look to you for inspiration, but I've been incredibly inspired by other people. And still am on a day-to-day basis. I actually think that most people are wonderful, amazing people. Yeah, we all have our weaknesses, and we all have things we don't do well, and we all have things about us that might annoy others, or that they annoy us. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that people are just, the vast majority of people are really good people who want to do good for their community, want to do good by their families, and want to bring something to the world. And the third, of course, as a rabbi, is faith in God. You know, I think people's faith and why they believe and how they believe is a very personal thing. But I think what unites that is a faith and understanding that it's not all about us, that there are things that we can't control. At the end of the day, we have to put faith in the Almighty, and as much as we do in the effort that we put into things, it's not all up to us. And I think the year 2020 has taught us that more than anything. You know, after all the advancement that we've made in so many different ways in the world, there are still things we don't understand. There are still things that are not in our control. And, you know, putting your faith in God is, it might not be so fashionable these days, but it's a really important part, I think, of understanding who we are as human beings.
That's really beautiful. You know, actually, it reminds me of something I said in a previous year, which is related to that, exactly that three-pronged approach. One of the reasons why we repeat Kol Nidre 3 times. And on Yom Kippur, there's a variety of prayers that we say 3 times. Why 3? And one of the answers given is because we're forgiving 3 different elements. There are 3, you know, we're forgiving ourselves, we're forgiving others, and we're also forgiving, so to speak, Hashem, you know, for the things that we can't understand when we look around the world. And so, you know, as you're saying, you know, I think pivotal to our personal growth and to moving forward and to our own mental health is kind of learning to forgive and learning to let go of certain things that we can't control, as you're saying. So I think, you know, that maybe that links nicely to what you're saying, the idea of belief, and also the flip side, which is on Yom Kippur, learning to forgive and let go and kind of be kind to yourself, be kind to others, be kind to Hashem. Yeah, just a nice idea.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea. Actually, you've given me already my next drasha for Yom Kippur.
saved you a few days. Let's now link it to Chanukah, because, you know, Chanukah is also a festival. I mean, all our festivals are about faith, right? Sukkot, you know, Hashem guided us in the desert. We had that faith. But Chanukah is really, you know, one of the more recent holidays. You know, it's still some 2,000 something years old, but it's
recent for Jews, I think. Yeah,
for Jews, exactly.
Recent for our religion, but I think, you know, I think there's a very clear link to Chanukah as well. I mean, if you think about what the family of the Maccabees and the Maccabees did, they obviously had to have a lot of faith and belief in themselves. Sort of the military rebellion and being able to, as a very small guerrilla force, push out the Greeks. That would have required an incredible amount of faith in themselves and what they believed in, the belief in others, you know, who they were bringing along the journey. And of course, you know, the part that we probably most often talk about because of the lighting of the Chanukiah, a belief in God, the idea of lighting the Chanukah candles, and even though there wasn't enough oil, and often we make kind of light, or we make jokes about the that part of it because we're so used to it, and it doesn't really make sense to us how it happened, and we kind of go, it's similar to if you had like 8% of battery on your smartphone today and it lasting 8 days. But I think that however that miracle happened, the point behind it was that it was an incredible, expression of their faith in restoring the Beit HaMikdash, restoring the temple, their connection to Hashem, and their ability to just go ahead and do something, even though they didn't necessarily understand where it was going to end up and how it was going to happen. But, once they'd gone through the different stages of being able to restore the Beit HaMikdash, to just go ahead and say, you know what, we've got to this stage, now we're putting it in the hands of God. We can't do everything. We're going to have a bit of faith in the Almighty that, this is what He wants us to do. This is the restoration of the Beit HaMikdash. And we're just going to go ahead and do it. So I think those three things in a lot of ways line up with a lot of the ideas of Chanukah and the concept of faith.
Yeah, beautiful. I actually heard it said elsewhere, the idea of faith, it's an inherent trait, inherent quality that we all have. We all have that capacity to believe and to almost like be selfless, to believe to such an extent that it's almost not about us anymore. It's a total devotion, a total commitment to the cause that we believe in, which is also like the essence of Chanukah, that complete self-sacrifice, as you said, not knowing where it's going to end up, but you just know that you're on the godly cause, and you're willing to lay your life down if necessary for it. That true, complete commitment, which that Hashem then reciprocates. Hashem then breaks the laws of nature as well to show that, the essence of the world, which is, the spark of God, which is infinite, then comes out and smashes, nature. And you have the whole miracle of the oil going beyond its nature as well. So it's almost like Hashem reciprocated when we had this incredible infinite belief that we brought out. Hashem then reciprocated by also showing us on His side how He's also, meeting us there and, in an infinite way, causing these miracles.
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea that if you give a little bit, Hashem will take you the rest of the way, and I think that's very true about the festival.
Perhaps there's a message in there for all of us in these challenging times, is that we just have to do our little part, and if we just dig deep and bring out that belief we have in ourselves, in others, in Hashem, then Hashem will do the rest, and Hashem will maybe show us modern day miracles and restore us and etc. There could be like the light at the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the year, Chanukah.
Exactly. So please God is all we can say, but I think the message is really very true. And I think we see it, the people who you see these people, you listen to them, and lots of different fields, not just in the rabbinic field, but kind of, you feel like they're a bit intense because everything that they're saying and doing and thinking is kind of geared towards, but a lot of the time you actually really feel, whatever profession is, that they actually truly believe in what they're doing, what they're saying, and that that's also incredibly inspiring for me as well. So yeah. Last
question for you.
Yes.
Last question.
I thought I already had my last question. What's the
last one? What have you found so far in your rabbinate past 5 years that you've been in? Is there anything that stands out, like one important quality that you found really helps you, really helps others? Is there one thing that stands out from people that you've met in the community, whether it be resilience or I don't know, something that has inspired you, something that keeps you going, that day to day? Maybe it's something that you wake up in the morning, you think that gets you out of bed. What can you leave us with to inspire us?
I don't know how inspiring it's going to be, but I think that, like I said before, I've been incredibly inspired by other people and what those people are prepared to give to the community. And without going into details, I guess that I've had to deal with people in incredibly difficult situations, whether that was end of life issues, whether it was Jewish identity issues. And I've almost always found that their ability to dig deep and get through the problems, or try and see the positive in it, and move to the other side and come out stronger. I mean, if you ask me what gets me out of bed, it is without doubt some of the stories that I've had through my 5 years. Obviously, like I said, there've been more difficult times, but I've also found that there's a lot of really good things about lots and lots of people and their ability to cope with those things and their ability to just, not just come out the other side, but come out stronger and come out more inspired and come out more with a really positive view on life. And I guess one of the things that I've learned in those 5 years is just to try and this is probably said as a cliche way too often, but I actually really believe it. And my wife actually has to help me a lot with it as well, because I don't necessarily think that that I'm naturally like this, but the ability to try and always see the positive in other people and other situations. And it's a cliche and it's often said, and maybe to do it too, people see people who do it too often as being a bit naive about other people's intentions, but I actually think being able to see the positive in other people, in our job at least, Rabbi Yossi, you kind of have to do that. And I think it's not just an important for in our professional roles, but it just keeps you so much happier and healthier. And I think that there is a lot of positive. I don't think you really have to dig that deep to see it, but to be able to kind of get out of bed and go, you know what, like what these people do is even with the little things, instead of looking at this person, I don't know, I'll try not to give specific examples, but just to try and go, look at the positive behind the person's intentions, the person's actions, and not to look at maybe the things that, at the end of the day, they annoy you, but they're very small little things which are not that important at the end of the day. So the ability to stay positive is, I think, and like I said, I'm no expert on the topic, but I think, just in the last 5 years, I found that if you can do that, or you can do that at least most of the time, it just makes your life so much happier and your job so much more meaningful, and your relationship so much more important and so much more meaningful. And, at the end of the day, I think no one really wants to be around a person that's really kind of looks at the negative and people want to be inspired by other people. People want to hear positive things about other people. People want to hear about ideas. They don't really want to hear about people talk about other people, as interesting as that can be sometimes. So trying to stay positive, trying to see the good in others, trying to talk about things which are going to add positivity to the world. I think that's a really important lesson that I've learned over the last 5 years.
What a beautiful way to finish. I could not agree with you more. That is what a great way to actually sum up the past 3 weeks we've had, and which is the message of Chanukah, that little bit of light. Let's choose to see the light, to see the positive. That's probably the greatest gift of all. And Rav Shua, thank you so much for your time tonight, for sharing with us your story, your personal story, your insights to faith, to Chanukah, your wisdom. And I've loved it. I've really enjoyed it. And a really honest discussion that we've had, and you've opened up, and thank you for sharing everything that you did. And
pleasure. Thanks for having me. And
I value our friendship, and God willing, can't wait to see what else you'll achieve. You're doing great work, and I can see why, because you're so relatable, so down to earth, and easy to get along with, and go from strength to strength.
Oh man, well, thanks for having me, and I'm sure we'll catch up over coffee soon. But thanks for having me, and thanks to those who are listening, and have a good night.